Immortality. This chapter is based on the Vedanta philosophy formulated in the three major Hindu scriptures, namely the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. There are many interpretations of Vedanta given by different commentators. The three main schools affirm non-dualism, qualified non-dualism, and dualism as the conclusion of Vedanta. Non-dualism teaches the ultimate oneness of Brahman, embodied souls, and the universe, and the unreality of the last two apart from Brahman. Its best-known exponent is Sankaracharya, AD 788 to 820. According to qualified non-dualism, whose chief exponent is Ramanujacharya, AD 1017 to 1137, the ultimate reality, though non-dual, admits the distinctions of God, living beings, and nature. Dualism asserts the reality of two principles, namely, the Supreme Being and the individual soul. Its chief exponent is Madhvacharya, AD 1199 to 1276. In this chapter, I have followed non-dualism. Sometime during the evolution of thought at the human level, when consciousness became self-conscious, the man asked himself three questions in one form or another: who am I? Whence have I come? Whither am I going? These remain man's perennial questions. Belief in the immortality of the soul, denial of it, and indifference or agnosticism seem to be as old as human thinking. For instance, one of the Upanishads, the philosophical section of the Vedas, which contains the earliest record of the Indo-Aryan religious and philosophical speculation, states that the tangible universe was, in the beginning, non-existent, and that names and forms arose from non-existence. The Charvaka school of Indian philosophy, accepting sense perception as the only valid proof of reality, denied the existence of both the soul and God. In another Upanishad, the pupil says to his teacher, "There is this well-known doubt about a man when he is dead. Some say he exists, others say that he does not." He seeks the answer to this doubt. On the other hand, belief in the continuation of life after death is widespread, perhaps more so than disbelief or doubt. It has factors were sought in the pre-scientific days. Technology has been admirable in tackling the problems of ill health, poverty, and illiteracy, and has all but annihilated distances. But science is only a means to an end. Man's goal should be the development of his spiritual faculties through a healthy body and mind and a stable society. Various interpretations of man have been given by the sciences. Man is a physical and chemical entity and obeys the laws of nature. A combination of certain elements has produced life. According to biologists, man is one of the animals. Like them, he eats, grows, reproduces, and dwells on earth. Sociologists study man as an individual in relation to other human beings endowed with certain social and cultural characteristics. Freud speaks of man in terms of libido or the sex impulse. None of these explanations is completely erroneous, but all are inadequate. They leave out an important element in the man, which is his soul. In short, people influenced by the physical sciences think that man is a psychophysical complex and may have a soul. Materialistic and mechanistic interpretations of man have fragmented him and made life empty. The sense of frustration of modern man has been caught by the sensitive poet T.S. Eliot, who writes, "We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless, as wind in dry grass, or rat's feet over broken glass. In our dry cellar, shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Sarojini Naidu, the Indian poet, expressed the emptiness of life in the following lines. Dream yields to dream. Strife follows strife. Till death unweaves the web of life. Many serious scientists, however, defer to the doctrine of immortality. They confess that knowledge of the soul is beyond the realm of scientific investigation, which is dependent upon sense data and the reasoning based upon them. The desire for immortality is apparently inherent in human nature. That people crave immortality is shown by their begetting children, creating works of art, erecting monuments, or in scholarship. Names are inscribed on stones or the bark of trees to perpetuate the memory even of ordinary people who have no claim to be remembered. Noticing such an inscription, Cowper wrote, "So strong the zeal to immortalize himself beats in the breast of man that even a few transient years, won from the abyss abhorred, of blank oblivion seem a glorious prize, even to a clown." In contrast to the physical sciences, religion gives a spiritual or sacramental interpretation of man and the universe. One of the assumptions of religion is the survival of the soul after death. Such a belief promises the devotee eternal happiness and peace. Indeed, if the soul does not survive death, who will enjoy the rewards of religion? The moral foundation of life is based on the belief that the soul continues to exist after death. Life on earth is short. One cannot experience all the consequences of one's action in the short span between birth and death. The Old Testament mentions resurrection, though Jewish prophets gave primacy to God and His holiness, power and justice. Hebrew prophecy is God-centered. The apocalyptic vision of immortality was transformed into a religious doctrine much later, especially in the writings of Maimonides, A.D. 1135 to 1204. Hellenistic and Eastern thought and the philosophy of Plotinus, among other factors, contributed to this transformation. Jesus was no doubt familiar from boyhood with the belief of his Jewish ancestors regarding the hereafter of the soul, and he spoke of life after death in heaven or hell. But what happened 3 days after the crucifixion, first witnessed by the grief-stricken women who went to the grave in a mood of anguish to anoint the body of Jesus, was made the strong pillar of Christianity by St. Paul. Despair over death was turned into the hope of eternal life. Resurrection, with its promise of the immortality of the soul, was formally accepted as the principal dogma of Christianity and incorporated in the Nicene Creed in AD 325. What had been an intuition of the Jewish prophets became the great support of Christianity. Hinduism, one of the major religions of the East, believes in the soul's immortality and its inevitable corollary, the doctrine of rebirth. The thought of countless millions of Hindus has been strongly influenced by these concepts. Immortality and rebirth explain to them the present inequality among men, show them the way to future improvement of their lot, and assure them of their ultimate liberation from the pain and suffering of life. Immortality, as understood by Hindus, is not a dogma but a metaphysical truth based upon direct experience. The scriptures and reasoning indicate it but do not attempt to prove it conclusively. The concept of immortality is intimately associated with the nature of the soul and ultimate reality or the Godhead. We shall first discuss the nature of reality. The seers of the Vedas discovered the eternal unity of existence which holds in its embrace all that has come to be. Reality is a seamless garment that includes superhuman, human and subhuman beings. It pervades the entire universe, forms the inmost essence of all created beings, and yet transcends all. As the reality behind the universe, it is called Brahman, and as the indestructible spirit in man, Atman. Brahman has been described in the Vedas from two standpoints, a cosmic or transcendental, and cosmic or phenomenal. From the transcendental standpoint, it is indescribable by words and cannot be characterized by any indicative marks or attributes, whence bonds together with the mind turn away. The impossibility of knowing Brahman by any human means has been expressed by the well-known Vedantic formula Neti, Neti, not this, not this. In speaking of Brahman or pure consciousness, the Upanishads usually employ the technique of negation, which cannot be seen or seized, which has no root or attributes, no eyes or ears, no hands or feet, which is imperishable and the source of all being. It is unknown and unknowable by the finite mind and is experienced in the depths of meditation by the illumined seers. All that can be predicated of Brahman is existence, to dispel the idea that it is non-existent or void. From the relative standpoint, however, the Vedas concede the empirical reality of the phenomenal universe and the multiplicity of creatures. Obviously, the attributeless non-active spirit cannot be the creator, nor an object of prayer and worship. No relationship can be established with it. It is too lofty for the finite mind to grasp. But man is eager to know the creator of the universe. A victim of fear, frustration, and suffering, he needs a savior and a personal God, who is benign and compassionate, and to whom he can lift up his hands or succor in times of stress and trial. These needs are supplied by the Vedic conception of the Saguna Brahman, or Brahman with attributes, who is the creator, preserver, and the destroyer of the universe. He is the personal God, the controller of all, the Lord, the ruler of all. Everywhere are his eyes, everywhere is his mouth, everywhere are his arms, everywhere his feet. Under the mighty rule of this immutable, the sun and the moon are held in their respective positions, heaven and earth maintain their positions, moments, days and nights, fortnights, months, seasons and years are held in their respective positions. His love for creatures knows no bounds. He is the all-forgiving Father, all-compassionate Mother, and ever-patient Teacher. He is not disturbed by man's good and evil deeds. A man acts rightly or wrongly in that world under the spell of delusion. When delusion is destroyed by the knowledge of God, God is revealed as the sun is when clouds disappear. Even the most sinful man, if he worships me with unswerving devotion, becomes a saint. He soon becomes righteous and attains eternal peace. These two Brahmans, with and without attributes, active and non-active, are not two separate entities but two aspects of the same reality. They are like the fire and its power to burn, or the gem and its luster. While active in creating and governing the world, reality is called Brahman with attributes or the personal God. While inactive, it is known as the attributeless pure spirit. It is the same water whether it is calm or agitated by waves. Brahman appears as the personal God through a power inherent in it, called Maya, a kind of metaphysical nescience, which first conceals the transcendental spirit and then projects the universe. It is a sort of oblivion that descends on a man when he falls asleep, and then sees dreams. Maya is incomprehensible to the finite mind, for the finite mind itself is projected by it and functions in the relative world. What the doctrine of Maya really teaches is that there lies hidden in the heart of reality a great mystery which makes the one appearing as many, and which, though motiveless and transcendental, projects the world of name and form and creates the notion of good and evil, pain and pleasure, life and death, and other pairs of opposites. It is emphasized by Vedanta that the conditioning of pure spirit by Maya is apparent and not real. Even when regarded as the creator and the preserver, Brahman remains untouched by activity, as the desert by the water of the mirage. Vedanta admits the fact of creation, but not the act of creation. Illusory mirage is a fact, but the desert does not become a mirage. All the waters of the mirage cannot wet a single grain of sand in the desert. When the devotee worships the personal God, the reality appears to him as his chosen ideal Krishna, Father in heaven, Vishnu or Shiva, and when the same devotee seeks to realize its absolute aspect, it withdraws its name and form and is revealed as Brahman or pure spirit. This is an act of grace. Based on the identity of Brahman and Atman, Hinduism has established the immortality of the soul. We shall now discuss the nature of the soul and its ultimate destiny. The Vedic philosophers, in their insatiable search for the first principle, carried on their investigation from two directions. As the study of the changing phenomena revealed an indivisible, eternal, intangible, and unlimited substance which is the substratum of the universe, so also the study of the changing tangible man revealed to them a reality, intelligent, conscious, and directly intuited, which animates the body, the sense organs, and the mind. They called the former by the name of Brahman, and the latter by the name of Atman, who functions as the witness of the states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. But Brahman, it may be contended, is a vague form of matter which is unlimited and intangible. Atman, or the consciousness associated with the individual, though directly intuited, can be a finite entity, limited by other individuals. Then in deep meditation, the seers of the Upanishads realized the oneness of Brahman and Atman as undifferentiated consciousness or pure spirit, and thus postulated a new dimension of reality which they called existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, or Satchidananda. It is infinite like Brahman, eternal, and also directly perceived as one's soul or inmost consciousness. The identity of Brahman and Atman has been expressed in the Upanishads by such well-known statements as I am Brahman, this self is Brahman, Brahman is consciousness, and all that exists is Brahman. It must be emphasized that this conclusion of non-dualistic Vedanta is neither a religious dogma nor a philosophical abstraction but a direct experience. Speculative philosophy creates doubt. A philosopher is a doubter. Vedanta, as in the case of Brahman, describes Atman from two standpoints, absolute or transcendental, and relative or phenomenal. From the absolute standpoint, Atman, or the soul, though dwelling in a changing and perishable body, is independent of the body. It is incorruptible, unchanging, divine, non-dual and without beginning or end. It is all peace, all knowledge, and ever free. The Bhagavad Gita says, only the bodies, of which this eternal, imperishable, incomprehensible self is the indweller, are said to have an end. He who looks on the self as the slayer, and he who looks on the self as the slain, neither of these apprehends aright. The self slays not, nor is it slain. It is never born, nor does it ever die, nor, having once been, does it again ceases to be unborn, eternal, permanent, and primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. Even as a person casts off worn-out clothes and puts on others that are new, so the embodied self casts off worn-out bodies and enters into others that are new. Weapons cut it not, the fire burns it not, water wets it not, the wind does not wither it. The soul is the source of attraction, verily not for the sake of the husband is the husband loved, but for the sake of the self. The same is true of the love that one feels for wife, children, men, gods and all created beings. The real attraction is that of soul, not flesh. The physical attachment is a distortion of the love of spirit coming through the channel of the body, senses, and mind. The soul, being the inmost essence of everything, cannot be perceived by sense organs or comprehended by the mind. You cannot see the seer of seeing, you cannot hear the hearer of hearing, you cannot think of the thinker of thinking, you cannot know the knower of knowing. This is the self within all, everything else but this is perishable. The soul is the pure intelligence that uses the sensed organs for perceiving external objects. It is described as the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, the speech of speech, the life of the life, and the eye of the eye. How can you know that which is the knower of knowing? He is never seen, but is the seer. He is never heard, but is the hearer. He is never thought of, but is the thinker. He is never known, but is the knower. There is no other seer than he. There is no other bearer than he. He is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. Everything else but him is perishable. Hindu philosophers and psychologists later indicated by reason the presence of the soul in man. In their opinion, any perception presupposes the presence of an unchanging spirit. The visible eye, the external instrument of perception, carries the impression of an object by the subtle optic nerve to the brain center. This starts a reaction of the mind which creates doubt. The intellect resolves it by referring to the storehouse of memories. This is followed by the reactions of the ego which are various and detached from one another, as is known from such statements as I am happy, I am unhappy, I am depressed, I am elated, and so on. As in a moving picture, there is the need for an unmoving screen on which the pictures must be focused to give the idea of continuity, so also there must be in man an unmoving detached element to unify the detached experiences of the ego. Otherwise, they cannot be coordinated. This still entity is the self, the witness consciousness. Secondly, the mind and the body are two layers of the same material substance, the mind being finer than the body. Both the body and the mind are in constant motion, and one can distinguish one movement from the other. The mind moves faster than the body. This difference in speech can be perceived only in relation to something which is motionless. This motionless entity is the self. Thirdly, the seer must be relatively one in order to see the diversity. Thus the eye is the seer, and various objects of the outside world are seen. But again, the eye, with its diverse characteristics of keenness, dullness, or blindness, is the seen and the mind is the seer. The mind, too, has various features such as doubt, deliberation, calmness, fickleness, fear, and fearlessness which are witnessed by consciousness. Consciousness is the final seer. If it were not, another perceiving consciousness would have to be postulated. But this would end in an infinite regress. In short, there is in man an unchanging consciousness, and this is the ultimate seer. It is Atman or the self. As mentioned before, the argument of the philosophers can only indicate, but not definitely prove, the existence of Atman. Philosophers think in terms of concepts. Atman is not a concept of the mind. When the mind is free from concepts and becomes still, then the true nature of Atman is revealed. Jehovah is described as I am that I am. The Christian gospel says, be still and feel I am your God. All that can be said of Atman is that it exists. This is unrelated to existence, time, and space, which project the phenomenal world. Though from the absolute standpoint, the soul is one without a second, from the phenomenal or relative standpoint, Hinduism admits the multiplicity of souls, Jivatma, and distinguishes them from the Supreme Soul, Paramatma. As the attributeless and non-active Brahman, with the help of Maya, projects the universe as the spider projects its web and thus becomes the creator, endowed with such attributes as omniscience, omnipotence, and compassion, so also the Supreme Self, under the influence of nescience, becomes identified with the physical body and individualized. It should be emphasized that whereas the Creator uses Maya as his instrument to project the universe, the embodied self comes under the influence of Maya. God is the controller of Maya, whereas the creature is controlled by Maya. The embodied soul, which is characterized by scant knowledge, little power, and other phenomenal characteristics, cherishes desires and becomes the agent of action and the experiencer of its fruit. It feels pleasure and pain as a result of virtuous or wicked deeds and experiences fear, fearlessness, and other pairs of opposites. Birth and death are related to the individual soul. So also the concepts of heaven, hell, and rebirth. These are governed by the law of time, space, and causation. As Brahman, while creating or preserving the universe, is in reality pure spirit, so also the embodied soul, while active in identification with the body, is nothing but the Supreme Self. Maya, or ignorance, like a cloud biding the sun, conceals the immortal nature of the soul, but cannot destroy it. Evil action makes the veil of ignorance thicker, and virtuous action makes it thinner, but behind Maya, thick or thin, the light of the spirit shines, like the sun behind the cloud. The Upanishads speak of two souls dwelling, as it were, in man, the real or the supreme soul, and the apparent or the individual soul. They are like two birds of similar plumage, inseparable companions, like light and shadow. One of the birds, hopping from one branch to another, eats sweet and bitter fruits and feels happy or unhappy, while the other, perched on the topmost branch, looks on without eating, serene and undisturbed. The apparent soul runs after the enjoyments of the world and feels elated or depressed. Bewildered by its impotence, now and then it gets a glimpse of the real soul and envies its calmness. When, through the practice of non-attachment and contemplation, it realizes its oneness with the Supreme Soul, its grief passes away. Birth and death apply to the apparent man. What happens to him after death? The materialistic doctrine of complete annihilation did not appeal to the Hindus. It is inconsistent with the desire for immortality innate in every person. It conflicts with the moral order of the universe. If everything ends in death, then competition determines our actions. Self-interest, either enlightened or crass, becomes the guiding principle. Life on earth becomes cruel, nasty, and brutish. The doctrine that the soul is created at the time of birth and then live forever lacks a rational basis. One does not see or cannot imagine how anything with a beginning should continue to exist without an end. This doctrine does not satisfactorily explain the fact of inequality between one man and another in the physical, mental, moral, or spiritual spheres. To attribute these inequalities to the will of God is to hypothesize a creator who must be cruel, dogmatic, or indifferent to the weal and woe of his creatures. If inborn tendencies and aptitudes are the results of the chance combination of the material particles of sperm and ova, the case is comparable to an explosion of types in a printing press producing Plato's Republic, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or Lady Chatterley's Lover. To explain character and personality by education and environment which, no doubt, have an influence upon them is not adequate. The law of cause and effect, which operates in the physical world, cannot be confined to one life alone. Habit is formed by repetition, so one can reasonably assume a previous life which supplies the blueprint of the present one. The doctrine of monotonous and eternal happiness in heaven did not impress the Vedic philosophers. Happiness, being an effect of righteous deeds, can endure only so long as the cause producing it operates. Everlasting life in terms of time is irrational. What begins in time must end in time. Time is the great devourer. Time, according to the Hindu philosophers, is a state of mental vibration. A dream experience, for example, covering several years, may be discovered to have lasted only a short time when the dreamer awakes. Likewise, from another standpoint, when the mind is vibrating differently, heaven may be of short duration. The subtle or spiritual body through which one experiences celestial happiness cannot last forever. A body consists of parts, which sometimes or other most fall apart. The earth, heaven, and other planes are parts of creation, controlled by the law of time, space, and causality. Hence, they cannot be eternal. The embodied person cannot be immortal. The immortality in heaven of which religions speak is relative. A denizen of heaven may live for more years than one can dream of here on earth. But even if life in heaven endures for an inconceivable length of time, it is still not true immortality. The doctrine of eternal suffering is inconsistent with God's impartial love for His creatures. Most people die as sinners. Consequently, they must suffer torment after death. This certainly cannot make our Heavenly Father, who has created men after His own image, happy. The soul, being an eternal portion of God, cannot be punished forever. Every creature, however wicked, must be given opportunities to get rid of his imperfection. On earth, the soul is exposed to many errors and temptations which an individual cannot always control. To believe in the eternal punishment of the soul for a mistake of a few years is to go against the dictate of reason. In contrast with annihilation or eternal retribution in heaven or hell, Hinduism formulates the doctrine of rebirth, which is the necessary corollary of the soul's immortality. If the soul is immortal, it must have had a pre-existence. Rebirth is governed by the law of karma. Even as the embodied self passes, in this body, through the stages of childhood, youth, and old age, so does it pass into another body. As soon as the fruit of past action and desires is reaped, the purpose of the present body is fulfilled. It is discarded. This accounts for the short or long life of a person on earth. What does he know of life, who knows one life only? The illumined can easily witness the passing of the soul from one body to another, but the ignorant person fails to see it in spite of his many efforts. According to the law of karma, man is the architect of his own fate and the builder of his own destiny. Fate is nothing but the accumulated result of his own past actions. Thus, a Hindu feels responsible for his present suffering and also looks for the future with courage and joy. The experiences of the hereafter cannot be demonstrated by the scientific method, as time, space, and other factors of experience are different on the two sides of the grave. Even if the dead were to tell us of their experiences, we would not understand them. According to the teachings of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, desires are responsible for man's embodiment on earth. They are of many kinds. Some can be fulfilled in a human body and others in a subhuman or superhuman body. Thus, a soul assumes an animal, a human, or a celestial body as determined by his unfulfilled desires. Through the animal or the celestial body, The soul only reaps the result of past actions. It cannot initiate new actions that will either produce an effect in a future life or hasten spiritual progress. This is possible only through a human body. Therefore, Hindus believe that birth in a human body is a unique privilege. The Vedas speak of different heavens where righteous souls enjoy happiness in different degrees. The highest is called Brahmaloka and is similar to the heaven of dualistic worshippers. There, the most intense joy is experienced for the longest period of time. In Brahmaloka, all desires are fulfilled. The soul enjoys uninterrupted communion with the Creator Brahma or the personal God. There one is free from sickness and old age and lives as long as the cycle lasts. A person who performs extremely meritorious action in this life but does not attain liberation through self-knowledge goes to Brahmaloka after death. Brahmaloka is a part of creation. There, individuality, however subtle, is retained for the enjoyment of the bliss of divine communion. Brahmaloka, with its inhabitants, merges into Brahman at the end of the cycle. Some souls, however, come back to earth from Brahmaloka for a new embodiment. Life in the highest heaven is described as immortality in the scriptures. According to non-dualistic Vedanta, which teaches the sole reality of Brahman and the unreal nature of the universe, this is relative immortality. Continued existence in time is quite different from liberation or non-dualistic immortality. The sole factor in the attainment of immortality or liberation is desirelessness. After pondering over the happiness that a man obtains from the fulfillment of desires through repeated births in different bodies ranging from the body of a blade of grass to the body of a denizen of Brahmaloka, he realizes that he has not attained true immortality. Then he gives up all desires and in the twinkling of an eye discovers immortality through the knowledge of the self. It comes like a flash of lightning. When all the desires that dwell in the heart fall away, then the mortal becomes immortal and here attains Brahman. The Gordian knot of repeated births is cut asunder in one stroke. It is a direct experience that has nothing to do with time. There is no relationship between time and timelessness. Immortality, it should be noted, is not the effect of knowledge. It is not something acquired. If immortality were the effect of knowledge and therefore had a beginning, it would then come to an end. All creatures are ever free from bondage and free by nature. They are ever illumined and always liberated. All that a seeker of immortality need to do is to get rid of the veil of ignorance that produces ego and desire. These are inevitable as long as one is attached to the body and the world. He must isolate himself from the psychophysical complex by the practice of spiritual disciplines. This demands self-effort. Immediately the man, who is always free, realizes his freedom. This experience comes by the grace of God. How does a man know that he has attained self-knowledge? Vedanta speaks of the three tests of truth. Truth is free from quarrel and free from contradiction, and it is conducive to the welfare of all. Only a partial truth sees contradiction and lies. Its usefulness is confined to a limited area. But the complete truth which makes a man see himself in all and all in himself, and see Brahman in himself and himself in Brahman, can neither fight nor contradict anything. He has known that by the knowing of which everything is known. His heart overflows with infinite compassion. The doctrine of the soul's non-duality fulfills all these conditions. Realization of the soul's immortality robs death of its paralyzing fear. The materialist tries to avoid death as long as he can and then accepts the inevitable end with stoic resignation. An agnostic on his deathbed, often depressed and distraught, finds nothing to hold to. Only a man who has experienced the immortal nature of the soul can say, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" If death gives finality to a man's existence, there is, then, nothing to be hoped for, nothing to be expected, and nothing to be done save to await our turn to mount the scaffold and bid farewell to the colossal blunder, the much ado about nothing world. It is immortality that gives stability and permanence to the soul, a unique possession which, if lost, leaves nothing else worth preserving in the world. The Vedas teach Atmavidya and Brahmavidya, the knowledge of the soul and the knowledge of Brahman. The Vedas exhort man, know thyself and give up all other vain words. Self-knowledge, as formulated in the Upanishads, is unique. It was regarded by the Vedic seers as more precious than offspring, wealth, and all the meritorious actions prescribed by religion. Therefore, they were chary of imparting it to one not properly qualified. Who is qualified for self-knowledge? The beginner must fulfill all obligations to family and society, practice daily devotion to God, acquire a general knowledge of the scriptures, and abstain from actions condemned by religion. Thus, a proper mode is created for the practice of higher disciplines, such as discrimination between the real and the unreal and detachment from the unreal, which includes craving for happiness in the tangible world and also in the unseen higher planes after death, control of the body and the mind, bearing the inevitable suffering of life with calmness, withdrawal from passing pleasures, introspection, meditation, and finally, an unflagging longing for liberation from the prison house of the universe. Such a qualified student approaches an illumined teacher with humility and receives instruction on the nature of the self. This instruction consists of the transmission of knowledge rather by silent influence than by words or examples. The student then reflects on the instruction and rids himself of doubt until, finally, he can meditate on the self with an undistracted mind. All traces of ignorance having been thus dispelled and the knots of doubt cut asunder, the knowledge of the identity of Atman and Brahman becomes revealed. The discovery of this identity is the ultimate goal of evolution. A knower of self is called a Jivan Muktavan, who is free while living in a physical body. How does he act? How does he move? How does he behave? A free soul is like a person who, having been sick, is made whole again, like one who, having been blind, has regained his sight, like one who, having been asleep, is awake. He has discarded the mask of individuality and discovered his all-pervasiveness as pure spirit. Whether absorbed in meditation or conscious of the outer world, his knowledge of the immortal nature of the soul is constant and his bliss steady. Though often he behaves like an ordinary mortal in respect of hunger, thirst, and other demands of the physical body, he is never overwhelmed by them. Though active, he is never involved in action nor does he crave its result, because he knows that the soul is neither the doer nor the enjoyer of the fruit of action. He is free from worry and tension, because he does not dwell on the past, remains unconcerned about the present, and is undisturbed by the thought of the future. Death, being a mere change of body or movement from one room to another, has no terror for him. Established in the knowledge of the oneness of existence, he regards the pleasure and pain of others as his own pain and pleasure. He cannot injure any creature by thought, word, or action, and he dedicates himself to the welfare of others. In short, a free soul lives, acts, and dies under the spell of immortality. A free soul, living in the world of duality, is undisturbed by its pairs of opposites, such as good and evil, pain and pleasure. Whether tormented by the wicked or honored by the good, he is always unruffled. Under repeated blows from the world, he remains unshaken, steady as an anvil. A free soul is not bound by scriptural injunctions, social conventions, or the imperatives of ethics. While preparing himself for self-knowledge, he had suppressed all selfish desires and wicked propensities. Now his goodness is spontaneous. He is free but not whimsical, natural but not given to license. He can never set a bad example for others. Such virtues as humility, unselfishness, charity, and sympathy which he had previously practiced as spiritual disciplines now adorn him like so many jewels. He does not strive for them, they cling to him. A free soul is not a miracle monger, nor does he advertise his holiness. As a fish swimming in water leaves no mark behind, or as a bird flying in the air leaves no footprint, so does he move in the world unnoticed by others. He can be recognized only by another free soul, as is the power of a lion by another lion, not by a barnyard fowl. In his presence, turbulent minds become quiet. To ordinary men, a free soul is an enigma. He is indifferent to wealth, fame, social status, or political achievement. Though without riches, he is ever content, though outwardly active, inwardly actionless, though seemingly helpless. He is endowed with exceeding power, and though detached from sense objects, he is inwardly satisfied. Though dwelling in a finite body, he is ever conscious of his infinite nature. The embodied soul, on account of its entanglement in the world, strives for liberation. The concepts of bondage and liberation apply only to the unillumined. But for the free soul, there is neither bondage nor liberation. A free soul, while living in the body, often experiences disease, old age, or decay. He may be a victim of blindness, deafness, or other infirmities, but having realized that these are the characteristics of the body, the mind, and the senses, he regards them as unreal and remains undisturbed. He witnesses events, whether in his body or mind or in the world, as a play on the stage. He enjoys them as the spectator of a comedy or tragic drama. To him, the events of the world are like the unfolding of a divine play. It is said in the Hindu scriptures that the body does not usually survive long after the attainment of self-knowledge. The impact of this experience shatters it and its nervous system. But death does not create any ripple in the mind of the free soul. When the purpose of the embodiment, namely the attainment of self-knowledge, has been fulfilled, what difference does it make whether the body remains or not? When the image is cast, the mold has lost its value. A free soul may with his own free will continue to live or assume a new body for the welfare of mankind. What happens to a knower of self after death? Does his soul go anywhere? The unillumined repair to different planes or return to the earth to satisfy their unfulfilled desires. Of him who is without desires, who is free from desires, the object of whose desires are but the self, the life breath does not depart. Being Brahman, he merges in Brahman. The water of the ocean goes up in the form of vapor, changes into clouds, falls on the earth as rain, and then becomes rivers, which are called by different names. After meandering through different lands, they ultimately disappear into the ocean, whence they originated. Just as the lifeless slough of a snake, when cast off, lies on an anthill, so does the body of the illumined after death. His soul emerges bright and radiant. Once his ignorance is destroyed, a free soul merges into light, knowledge, freedom, and reality, and never again enters into darkness, bondage, ignorance, or illusion. When the butterfly has emerged from the chrysalis, it does not re-enter its cocoon but flits from flower to flower, bathed in the light of the sun. As milk poured into milk becomes one with milk, water poured into water becomes one with water, oil poured into oil becomes one with oil, so the free soul absorbed in Brahman becomes one with Brahman. I have discussed immortality from the standpoint of non-dualistic Vedanta, which is the peak of Hindu philosophical speculation. It should be mentioned here that there are many Hindus who follow the dualistic school of Vedanta and regard souls as parts of God, like sparks of the blazing fire, or as separate from God, as servants are from their master or children from their parents. But all admit the soul's immortality and its eventual perfection. Three other contributions made by Hindu philosophers to the thought current of the world may be mentioned at this point. They are the oneness of existence, the non-duality of the Godhead, and the harmony of religions. It may be noted that the worth of the individual is the spiritual basis of the freedom and democracy so greatly prized in the West. A man should be evaluated by his inherent worth and not by the color of his skin, by his religious affiliation, social position, or economic rank. The oneness of existence is the spiritual basis of the golden rule and other ethical laws. By hurting others, a man hurts himself. Conversely, by loving others, he loves himself. The oneness of existence includes all created beings, organic or inorganic. The non-duality of the Godhead and the harmony of religions, if rightly understood and properly practiced, eliminate religious friction. Truth is one, sages call it by various names. God is the goal and religion is the means to his realization. A true lover of God should have complete loyalty to his own faith, but unreserved respect for the faith of others. Many people in the West are taking an interest in the theory of rebirth, which to them is often the same as the immortality of the soul. Belief in rebirth may bring comfort to those who are afraid of annihilation after death or of boredom in heaven. To a Hindu, however, the ultimate goal of life is not to be born again and again on earth or anywhere else where life is not free from certain limitations. But he regards rebirth as an important corollary of the immortality of the soul. It explains to him the seeming chaos of the moral inequality, injustice, and manifold evil present in the world of human life, and provides a strong motive for self-denial and the striving to get rid of one's imperfections. The immortality of the soul, an inner experience, cannot be tested by a physical scientist in his laboratory. But the scientific method of experimentation, observation, and verification, as well as the collection of facts and their correlation, can be applied to verify it. The immortality of the soul, with its corollary of rebirth, provides the unbiased, scientifically oriented mind with a good hypothesis with which many scientific investigations start. We can test it by acting on it. Then we shall know whether or not it works. It is more reasonable to believe in immortality than to disbelieve in it. It is more probable than improbable. A man can live by it as if it is true. From the doctrine of reincarnation and immortality, he will certainly derive courage and inspiration to face the many baffling problems of life as serenely as countless millions of Hindus have done during the past thousands of years.